We're going to start today. On metabolism and energetics. You already read this for the previous exam. It's just a couple of particular aspects of metabolism that I wanted to go into a little detail about with you, just so you're familiar with. You will get questions on the exam this time out of the chapter related to metabolism. I think that's chapter 25. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. 25. Okay. Basically, I just want to talk about nutrients and nutrient reserves. Now, those of you going into nursing will have to take nutrition, and so you'll be even more familiar with this after you take that course. But recognize that most cells store energy. They have to prepare for a rainy day is the term that your textbook uses. But basically, it's storing energy for a period of an emergency, an interval of extreme activity, or basically a time where the supply of nutrients in the bloodstream may be inadequate. So cells prepare for that type of a period of time by building up reserves. Nutrients are stored in many forms, and then these nutrients have to be mobilized, and so there are specific mechanisms inside the body that will help this mobilization take place. The most abundant form of storage is carbohydrates. We all are probably familiar with that. Carbohydrates in the body are stored in the form of glycogen. Glycogen basically is a branched chain glucose molecule, has the most abundant energy storage of the readily accessible types of nutrients. Now, when we talk about sheer quantity of storage of energy, we look at the lipids or the triglycerides, which mainly consist of fatty acids. They store a tremendous amount, and actually the most abundant amount of stored energy in the body. And then proteins are another source, and we'll talk about proteins in a little bit, but proteins on the chain are very low. The body would prefer to take carbohydrate storage first, then defers to lipids, and then would take proteins only in extreme circumstances. Muscle cells and liver cells store glucose in the form of glycogen. Adipocytes and liver cells will store triglycerides, so these will be the sites. These are the areas where we will pull reserves. Now, proteins are the most abundant organic component in the body. Now, look, I've used the word abundant several times here. First, carbohydrates, that's where we're readily going to get our source. So it's the most abundant site for readily accessible types of energy. But as far as storage goes, the most abundant site are lipids. Lipids have much more stored energy than the rest of the components. But when we talk about organic substances in the body, the organic components, is proteins. It performs a variety of vital functions in the cells, has a tremendous amount of energy available. Cells will synthesize additional proteins where needed. When glucose or fatty acids are unavailable, then proteins can be broken down into components of amino acids, and amino acids are catabolized as an energy source. So although their primary function is not to serve as energy, for proteins, their primary function is not to serve as energy. Proteins are so abundant and accessible that they can represent what's referred to as your book, again in your textbook, as a last-ditch available source of nutrient reserve. But it is not the first source. It's not the first source. It's the most abundant organic compound. Lipids are the most abundant, readily available energy source. Carbohydrates are our first source where we try to get energy from as a nutrient reserve. So the nutrient pool is a source of substrates. Both or all are used for catabolism or anabolism. As you might expect, cells tend to conserve materials needed to build new compounds and break down the rest. Cells continuously replace membranes, organelles, enzymes, structural proteins. As you recall, cell membrane composed of proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. Organelles have a phospholipid layer that surrounds them, so thus their membrane covering are made up of the same organic substances. Enzymes, proteins, structural proteins as well. So you can see the importance again of proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. Anabolic activities require more amino acids than lipids and or few carbohydrates. Generally, when we talk about cells with excess carbohydrates, lipids, and amino acids that are needed for energy, it'll break down carbohydrates first. Lipids are the second choice, as I said before, and then amino acids are seldom broken down components of proteins, seldom broken down as energy sources. Now, the mitochondria provide energy support for cellular operations. We've already talked about the mitochondria as a powerhouse, the ever-ready battery for the system. Cell feeds its mitochondria with nutrient pool, and it also gets energy derived from the mitochondria for the production of ATP. Inside the mitochondria is where the TCA cycle or the Krebs cycle will take place. I'll go into a little more detail about that in just a bit. When carbohydrates are used as an energy source, carbohydrates go through a process referred to as glycolysis, where the 6-carbon sugar is broken down into a 3-carbon sugar. 3-carbon sugar, pyruvic acid, is then brought into the mitochondria, and then inside the mitochondria, pyruvic acid, through a series of enzymatic steps, is converted to ATP in the presence of oxygen. So chemical reaction in the cytoplasm, whichever organic nutrients are available, it will break them down into smaller fragments that the mitochondria can then process. Now, that's an important statement because you'll see later on in this lecture that not only carbohydrates are broken down that way, but you can also see where proteins can be broken down into smaller carbon fragments and then brought into the mitochondria to go through the TCA cycle. You will also see how lipids, which are long chains of fatty acids, number of carbons strung together, also broken up into small carbon fragments, then brought inside the mitochondria where it will go through the TCA cycle. So mitochondrial activity involves two pathways: the enzymatic steps of the Krebs cycle or the TCA cycle, and then there's also a portion called the electron transport system, again, which I'll go into a little more detail about in just a bit. As you can see on the illustration that's before you now, these are the structural components that we've talked about: triglycerides or lipids, the glycogen or the glucose, the proteins, which are the amino acids. Each of them will get broken into components from the nutrient pool, which make up the nutrient pool, I should say. Triglycerides are the fatty acids. Glycogen, when broken down, makes available glucose, and then proteins make available amino acids. Through a series of enzymatic steps, for glucose, which we'll talk about specifically first, there's a process referred to as glycolysis. Glycolysis takes place in the cytosol, in the cytoplasm. Important to know where glycolysis takes place. It takes place in the absence of oxygen. In the presence of oxygen, that's considered aerobic. In the absence of oxygen is considered anaerobic. So glycolysis, the breakdown of glucose into pyruvic acid, is a anaerobic step in this process of generating energy. Now, because it's anaerobic and because it takes place outside of the cytoplasm, it requires energy to take place. So it will use a little ATP, the energy that's produced inside the mitochondria, to process that glucose, to break that glucose down into 2,3 carbon fragments. Now, once those 2,3 carbon fragments are broken down, as the illustration shows you, a small carbon chain, it's then broken down, and then it can pass into the mitochondria. Inside the mitochondria, the TCA cycle takes place. You need to know where the TCA cycle takes place, also called the Krebs cycle. It takes place inside the mitochondria, number of enzymatic steps, electrons are produced. These electrons generate the energy of ATP in the presence of oxygen. As a byproduct, you see CO2 is given off in this process. So that's aerobic metabolism. Aerobic metabolism will generate a significant amount of energy, much more so than anaerobic metabolism. But again, we need anaerobic metabolism. Why? If we didn't have anaerobic metabolism, we wouldn't be able to get the small carbon chain into the mitochondria to produce additional ATP. So in each one of those other nutrient pools, whether it's proteins, whether it's lipids, fatty acids, all of those will go through enzymatic processes which will break the long chains of carbon, the long organic structure, into smaller fragments. Those smaller fragments then enter the mitochondria and will go through the process, the TCA cycle, to generate energy. So nutrients use cellular metabolism, the contents of the nutrient pool, to build up the reserves. They synthesize cellular structure. Catabolism within the mitochondria provides the ATP that's necessary to keep energy available for the system. The mitochondria basically fed these small carbon chains produced by the breakdown of carbohydrates. Again, comes from the storage component of glycogen, lipids, especially fatty acids from triglycerides, and then proteins, the components of amino acids. So each one of those can be broken down to feed the mitochondria so the mitochondria can produce additional energy. Mitochondria absorb these breakdown products. Further catabolism means that the TCA cycle, the tricarboxylic acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain intimately involved. That's inside the mitochondria. You need to know, again, Krebs cycle inside the mitochondria. Nutrients that are involved here, there's a significant energy cost for staying alive, even when the body's at rest, because even while your body is at rest, cellular metabolism has to continue. The digestive processes continue. The respiratory processes continue. The cardiovascular processes continue. Again, on a cellular level, these cells never stop. On an organ system level, these organs never stop. Continually, blood circulation continues. The exchange of oxygen for CO2 continues. So the body is a dynamic being, and so energy has to continually be produced. So cells have to spend additional energy in performing other vital functions such as growth, secretions. There are hormones that are produced inside the body. When we talk about the endocrine system in AMP2, we'll get into the secretions of certain hormones. Contractions, muscular contractions, smooth muscle contractions, which basically never stop inside our body, all require energy. Cells are chemical factories. They break down organic molecules. Obtain energy from these chemical molecules is used to generate ATP. Reactions within the mitochondria provide most of the energy needed for the typical cell. Now, to carry out these metabolic reactions, cells must have a reliable supply of oxygen, nutrients, including water. Water is the most abundant substance in the body. Water, organic or inorganic? Somebody help me out. Water, organic or inorganic? What makes a substance organic? Carbon. Does water, H2O, have carbon in it? So it must be inorganic. So most abundant inorganic substances in the body. But we also require the nutrients, organic substances, vitamins, minerals, ions, other organic substrates and reactants that go through enzymatic processes. Mitochondria break down organic nutrients, provides energy for cell growth, cell division, contraction, secretion, and other functions. So these activities, these levels have to change rapidly inside the body. There is a significant energy demand that we see in various types of tissues, all of which have metabolic levels that have to be maintained. Energy sources in the form of carbohydrates are essential. The term metabolism, you need to know that definition, refers to all chemical reactions that occur in an organism. Chemical reactions within inside the cell collectively are referred to as cellular metabolism, which provides energy needed to maintain homeostasis and other essential functioning. Metabolic turnover is basically the periodic breakdown and replacements of organic components. We also see as a part of the function, remember I like function, of metabolism, growth and cellular division. There's special processes such as secretion, contraction, and the propagation of action potentials, and we'll talk about that more when we do the muscle system. Cells absorb organic molecules from surrounding interstitial tissue, amino acids, lipids, and simple sugars cross the membrane and join nutrients already in the cytoplasm. All cells, organic building blocks, collectively form a nutrient pool. Again, these cells rely on this to provide energy. This is just an illustration, again, out of your book that demonstrates the maintenance, the response of catabolism and anabolism, basically demonstrating maintenance and repair, growth, secretion, stored reserves, the nutrient pool, the organic molecules, again, proteins, lipid, carbohydrates, and their components, amino acids, lipids, simple sugars, triglycerides, etc. And then the process of catabolism, which takes place inside the mitochondria. Again, the TCA cycle, electron transport chain, the TCA cycle, you got to know that takes place inside the mitochondria. And then the expenses that are used, what requires the use of ATP, the primary energy source, and this just lists all of those processes at a cellular level. that require the use of ATP. Only about 40% of the energy released by catabolism is captured in the form of ATP. The rest is lost as heat. The body generates a tremendous amount of heat. ATP generated by catabolism provides energy for all the vital cellular activities, including anabolism. And the breakdown of organic substrates is referred to as catabolism. Another definition you need to know. Process releases energy, can be used to synthesize ATP or other high energy compounds. Catabolism proceeds in a series of reactions. In general, the initial step occur in the cytosol. Enzymes will break down large organic molecules. So glucose, glycogen broken down into glucose. Glucose passes through the cell membrane, selectively permeable membrane. Need insulin. Insulin binds the ligand, connects to the receptor, brought inside the cell. Glucose gets inside the cell, inside the cytoplasm, broken down into small carbon fragments in a process referred to as glycolysis. In the absence of oxygen, an anaerobic step that occurs in the cytoplasm. You have to know where glycolysis takes place. And then from that process, we'll see, again, carbohydrates broken down into simple sugars. Triglycerides may get broken into fatty acids still inside the cytoplasm. But then that generation of ATP takes place inside the mitochondria through a process referred to as the TCA cycle. Relatively little ATP is produced during the preparatory steps, so in glycolysis, relatively small amounts of ATP are produced. It actually uses an ATP in that process. Further catabolic activity produces smaller organic molecules that can be absorbed and processed by the mitochondria. I've already said mitochondrial activity releases significant amount of energy. Mitochondrial enzymes break down the bonds that hold molecules together. Captures about 40% of the energy, and in that series of steps, and again, I'm not going to ask you to give me the series of steps involved in a TCA cycle, but again, I want you to know the TCA cycle is important for generation of ATP. About 60% of the energy generated escapes as heat, and so the body in this process of catabolism, generates a significant amount of heat. ATP produced in the mitochondria provides energy to support anabolism, the synthesis of new organic molecules and other cell functions. And these additional functions we've discussed briefly in some of the other lectures. Ciliary motion, the cilia, little finger-like projections in the cells in the respiratory tract or in the reproductive tract that actually help to move substances through the passageways. Contractile activity, active transport, such as the movement of substances across the cell membrane. Cell division, which has to take place. So a significant amount of cellular activity is dependent upon energy. The term energy anabolism basically is an uphill process, involves the formation of new chemical bonds. Cells synthesize new organic components and, for four basic reasons: to perform structural maintenance and repair, to support growth, to produce secretions, and to store nutrient reserves. Most cells, again, have to prepare for that rainy day. And so it's a period of emergency, intervals of extreme activity. This is a time the energy supply or nutrients in the bloodstream may be inadequate, so these energy reserves, these stored nutrients, are available for that process. Now, this is the metabolism of carbohydrates, and I've already kind of gone over that in earlier part of this lecture, but most cells will generate ATP and other high energy compounds by breaking down carbohydrates. This is the most available, readily usable energy source in the body. Now, as far as abundance goes, remember lipids, it's more lipids available for energy, but readily available is carbohydrates. Lipids, it's much more of a process to break those down, and I'll show you that in just a bit as well. So the complete reaction sequence, the 6 carbon chain, glucose, which is the first chemical structure that you see, and I'm not going to ask you this on an exam, but this is just the first chemical structure that you see, will produce, is broken down into carbon dioxide and water as the complete reaction takes place for the production of energy. The breakdown occurs in a series of small steps. Several release sufficient energy to support conversion of adenosine diphosphate to adenosine triphosphate. Triphosphate is the energy. A phosphorylation step, the addition of phosphate has to be there for the reaction to be completed. The complete catabolism, 1 molecule of glucose, provides the typical body with a net gain of 36 molecules of ATP, which is a significant amount of energy production. Most ATP production occurs inside the mitochondria. The first step takes place in the cytosol. The process of glycolysis, again occurring in the cytoplasm, in the cytosol, breaks down glucose in the cytosol and generates smaller molecules that can then be absorbed by the mitochondria. Glycolysis does not require energy. The reaction, again, is referred to as an anaerobic process. The subsequent reactions that take place in the mitochondria do consume oxygen and thus are referred to aerobic. You do need to know those two terms, anaerobic, aerobic. Mitochondrial activity responsible for ATP production, called aerobic metabolism or cellular respiration. Glycolysis, the breakdown of glucose to pyruvic acid. Process, a series of enzymatic steps that breaks down the 6-carbon molecule into 2 3-carbon molecules, pyruvic acid. You need to know glycolysis. You need to know pyruvic acid. Now, glycolysis requires the following: glucose molecules, appropriate cytoplasm enzymes, ATP, ADP, inorganic phosphates, and also a coenzyme. And I don't know if we've talked about coenzymes. Coenzymes basically are substances that are also a part of a chemical reaction. They facilitate the reaction. I won't say any more than that about them. But basically NAD, which is the N stands for nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. It's basically just another reactant that's in that enzymatic process. Glycolysis begins with an enzyme that phosphorylates or attaches a phosphate group to the 6-carbon of the glucose molecule. And then basically in this process, glucose is trapped in the molecule within the cell. And because it's phosphorylated glucose, it can't cross the cell membrane, so it can't escape back out the cell. This prepares glucose molecule for further biochemical reactions. And then, as you'll see again through a series of steps, you'll see anaerobically glucose gets broken down and converted in this process of glycolysis into smaller chains of carbon. Now, skeletal muscle fibers rely on glycolysis for ATP production. During periods of active muscle contraction, ATP provided by glycolysis alone, most cells can only provide for brief periods of time. Now, skeletal muscles, lifting weights, is an anaerobic process. It uses glycolysis. Glycolysis occurs in the absence of oxygen. That's an anaerobic process. We won't go into a lot of detail about it today, but anaerobic exercise actually helps build muscle mass. And in this process, though, the drawback is the production of a substance referred to as lactic acid. Lactic acid can change the acidity of the body. The normal pH is 7.35 to 7.45, but in these high states of activity where a lot of lactic acid is generated, it actually can affect the acidity. So anaerobic metabolism is only good for brief periods of time. Smaller amount of energy produced, smaller amount of ATP produced, but the downside of it is lactic acid generates and can change the acidity of the body. So we need anaerobic metabolism, yes, but cells can only survive for a brief period of time with anaerobic metabolism or the process of glycolysis. So when I say anaerobic metabolism, referring to glycolysis in this instance. When oxygen is readily available, mitochondrial activity provides most of the ATP required for cells. That's the most efficient way. Mitochondria, again, responsible for the production of ATP. Now, in the mitochondria, we've already talked about its structural makeup. You know, the mitochondria is a membranous organelle. It's covered by a phospholipid layer. Now, not a phospholipid bilayer, but a phospholipid layer. So the outer membrane contains a large diameter or pores that are permeable to ions and permeable to small organic molecules, such as pyruvic acid, 3-carbon now, The ions and molecules easily can enter the inner membrane space, separating the outer membrane from the inner membrane. The inner membrane contains basically a carrier protein that moves pyruvic acid into the mitochondrial matrix. Then the TCA cycle will begin a series of enzymatic steps that's involved in converting that 3-carbon chain, that 3-carbon structure molecule that's been brought into the mitochondria, producing that into a source of energy, ATP. Also referred to as a tricarboxylic acid cycle. Again, this illustration I showed you earlier, the nutrient pool, triglycerides, fatty acids, glycogen, glucose, proteins, amino acids, all of which can be broken down into small carbon chains. You need to know that general concept. All of these nutrient pool, all these nutrient substances can be broken down into smaller carbon fragments, brought into the mitochondria, go through the process of the TCA cycle, and generate ATP. These are the number of steps that take place. These are the steps that take place in the TCA cycle. Again, I'm not going to ask you to go through those steps. I just want you to appreciate the concept of what takes place. Oxidative phosphorylation is an important process in the generation of ATP within the mitochondria. It's a reaction sequence. It requires that coenzyme I talked to you about. It also requires oxygen, because where it's inside the mitochondria, that's where aerobic activity is going to take place. This process produces more than 90% of the ATP that's used in the body. Key to the reaction also is the electron transport chain. This is a series of integral and peripheral proteins in the inner mitochondrial membrane. So you need to appreciate the general concept of oxidative phosphorylation in the generation of ATP, and also the key reaction of the electron transport chain in this process as well. Number of other reactions that take place: oxidation and reduction reactions take place. Oxidation reaction refers to the loss of an electron. Reduction refers to the acceptance of a electron. These enzymatic steps of oxidative phosphorylation involve oxidation and reduction reactions. You need to appreciate oxidation and reduction as it relates to oxidative phosphorylation. Oxidative phosphorylation, again, generation of ATP. 90% ATP generated in that process requires oxidation and reduction to take place. The electron transport chain, or the respiratory chain, a sequence of proteins are involved in this generation of energy. These proteins are referred to as cytochromes. Each of these cytochromes have two components, a protein component and a pigment component. The proteins are embedded in the inner membrane of the mitochondria, surrounds the pigment complex, which contains metal ions, iron, copper, primarily used. 4 major cytochromes are a part of this process. Not asking you to know those. It's just a part of this energy production step that we'll see take place in the production of ATP. Again, the importance of oxidative phosphorylation, most important mechanism in the generation of ATP. Most oxidative phosphorylation slows or stops when the cells die, and so many cells are affected when an individual or individual cells may die. And remember, for oxidative phosphorylation to take place, oxidation and reduction reactions have to be produced as well. Just a little concept. This is one of those little black box comments that's inside your book. Talks about cyanide gas. Hydrogen cyanide gas is sometimes used as a pesticide, kills rats, mice, and other infestations as well. In some states where capital punishment is legal, they utilize this to execute criminals. Cyanide ions basically will bind to the cytochromes, those proteins that we talked about, prevents the transport of electrons to oxygen, so it stops this energy production step and cells will die. As a result, the cells die from oxygen starvation. The individual will die from oxygen starvation as well. Process referred to as gluconeogenesis. You need to be familiar with that term. Basically, is the synthesis of glucose from non carbohydrate precursors such as lactic acid, glycerol, and amino acids. Fatty acids and many amino acids cannot be used for glucose neogenesis because their catabolic pathways produce acetyl-CoA, and acetyl-CoA is a molecule that you'll see that's involved in the TCA cycle as well. But gluconeogenesis is basically the synthesis of glucose from non-carbohydrate precursors. The reason why I bring this up is we see glucose broken down, the 3 carbon structures enters into the mitochondria. The opposite can take place as well. These 3 carbon structures or 2 carbon structures can be joined together to form glucose molecules, can be further carry a process of storage in the skeletal muscles and glucose, and is stored in the form of glycogen. So glucose molecules created in gluconeogenesis can be manufactured or can manufacture other simple sugars, complex carbohydrates, proteoglycans, and our nucleic acids. And again, this storage component, glycogen, would be stored in skeletal muscles, liver, and can be used later as a part of the nutrient pool if energy is needed during times of heavy activity. The formation of glycogen from glucose is known as glycogenesis, similar as we saw with gluconeogenesis. Complex process involves several steps, requires high energy compounds for that to be able to take place. Any of these generating processes, as you'll see, will require energy. UTP is not so important as you're appreciating the concept of what takes place in the formation of glycogen from glucose. So again, we can see glycogen in a catabolic reaction where glycogen is broken down into glucose, glucose broken into pyruvic acid, the 3 carbon sugar, taken inside the mitochondria, generates energy. We also can see in times of excess nutrient, the opposite can take place. Carbon fragments are joined together in the production of glucose. 2, 3 carbon structures can be joined together, forms complex carbohydrates, glucose, stored in an energy form such as glycogen through glycogenesis, and then we'll see this stored in the liver or in the muscles. Glycogen is important energy reserve, can be broken down when cells cannot obtain enough glucose from the interstitial fluid. Again, carbohydrates are readily available circulating in the system. However, when energy demands are great, you use up the carbohydrates, you decide to run 5 miles today, you use up the readily available glucose that's circulating in the system, then you have to start breaking down glycogen from your stored energy. Breakdown of glycogen called glycolysis, glycogenolysis, basically process by which you see glycogen broken down. Although glycogen molecules are large, they're significant reserves, and again, they're very compact and they're easily broken down as an energy source. Now, that's carbohydrates. Like carbohydrates, we see lipid molecules can contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, but the atoms that are present are in different proportions. Triglycerides are the most abundant lipid in the body. During lipid catabolism, we see lipid is broken down. Lipolysis, basically lipids broken down into pieces that are either converted into pyruvic acid. Where did we see pyruvic acid before? We saw that when carbohydrates were broken down. So we can see lipids will go through a process as well. Triglycerides, I can't talk today. A triglyceride is first split into its component parts by hydrolysis. The step yields molecules of glycerol and fatty acids. You see the steps will yield 1 molecule of glycerol, 3 fatty acid molecules. Glycerol enters the TCA cycle after the enzymes in the cytosol convert it to, again, pyruvic acid. So pyruvic acid, key player, as you see the relationship now between carbohydrates and lipids, or the similarity at least between carbohydrates and lipids in the breakdown. Catabolism of fatty acid involves a completely different set of enzymes. Fatty acid molecules are broken down into 2 carbon fragments in a sequence of reactions known as, need to know this, beta oxidation. So fatty acid molecules broken down, 2 carbon fragments, sequence of reactions referred to as beta oxidation. The process occurs inside the mitochondria, so carbon chains can enter the TCA cycle immediately. So this process as well, you'll see, takes place inside the mitochondria. Again, the carbon chains can enter the TCA cycle. Here's that illustration that you've seen before. We walk through glycogen, glucose, small carbon into the mitochondria. Same steps here when we look at lipids. Triglycerides, most abundant form available, breaks down fatty acids. Again, small carbon chains enter into the TCA cycle. These are just the chemical structures. As you can see, the long chains of fatty acids for lipids. Beta oxidation. During beta oxidation, carbon chains, fatty acids broken down to yield molecules of acetyl-CoA, which is used in the TCA cycle. Again, acetyl-CoA is the first player that we see in the TCA cycle. Again, the similarities. Once you get to pyruvic acid, the similarities in the use of lipids and the use of carbohydrates now are identical. Substantial energy benefit, 2 carbon fragments removed from fatty acid cells gain 12 ATP molecules from processing acetyl-CoA. So as you can see, you still see a significant amount of energy production benefit coming from the benefit from the use of lipids as an energy source. Lipids are important as an energy reserve because they can provide large amounts of ATP. Since they are insoluble in water, lipids can be stored in compact droplets in the cytosol. Lipid reserves are significant. The net result in lipids cannot provide large amounts of ATP in a short time. Cells with modest energy demand can shift to lipid-based energy production when glucose supplies is limited. In essence, carbohydrates used first. Carbohydrates always used first. Once carbohydrates are used up, then the body defers to lipid stores to be able to get its energy. Low carb diets or no carb diets, our body uses up the carbohydrates that are in the system very readily first. Once we don't have carbohydrates, then the body starts getting the lipid reserves. This is why you lose weight in this process, because then the body defers to the lipids that are stored in the body. If you're taking lipids in, you're using lipids, lipids aren't going to get stored. So that's why you can eat the meats and other high fat content foods, because the lipids are being burned as a ready energy source. Once you start beta oxidation, nothing's going to be stored because you need the fats as an energy source. The downside to this, though, this lipid metabolism, again, beta oxidation is just the generation, the breakdown of fatty acids tend to drop the blood pH to a dangerous level. So you become acidotic, and during a low-carb diet or a no-carb diet, you stay in this continued state of acidosis, again, below 7.35. For short periods of time in healthy people, not a big deal. And people who have medical problems, diabetics, other metabolic disorders, these individuals can have dire consequences by being on low-carb or no-carb diets. So you have to use a degree of caution when utilizing that. But basically, lipid metabolism in the body, skeletal muscle, fibers, normally cycle between lipid metabolism and carbohydrate metabolism. At rest, when energy demands are low, cells break down fatty acids. During activity, when energy demands are large or immediate, skeletal muscle fibers shift to glucose metabolism. Lipid synthesis pathway begins again with acetyl-CoA. We see molecules of acetyl-CoA strung together in the cytosol, yielding fatty acids which can be used in the synthesis or the generation of glycerides and other lipids. So lipids can be synthesized from amino acids or carbohydrates by using acetyl-CoA. The synthesis of lipids is referred to as lipogenesis. So just as we saw with carbohydrates, sugars can be formed, gluconeogenesis, by stringing together the carbon chains. You see the similar process with lipids in times of excess. Energy demand is low by the body. Carbon chains can be strung together, again, to generate lipids. Lipids are stored as well. The process, again, of the synthesis of lipids, lipogenesis. You see the pathways here again in lipogenesis. Again, acetyl-CoA, primary constituent or the building block, generate the fatty acids. Then fatty acids in the process of lipogenesis goes to glycolipids, phospholipids, prostaglandins, cholesterols, and steroids as well. Essential fatty acids you should be familiar with. Linoleic acid, linolenic acid, both are 18 carbon unsaturated fatty acids, cannot be synthesized in the body through this process of lipogenesis. They are called essential fatty acids because they must be included in the diet. You need to know the concept of linoleic and linolenic acid, why they're referred to as essential fatty acids. Linoleic acid and linolenic acid basically are synthesized by plants. We can't do it. Deficiencies of essential fatty acids generally occur among hospitalized individuals receiving nutrients and intravenous solutions. When you get into clinical work, you'll see that many patients receive a substance referred to as total parental nutrition. These individuals, for some reason, can't take in food. Either they have problems, dysfunction with the esophagus, problems with the swallowing mechanism, may have a problem in the digestive tract, problem with the stomach, may have portions of the bowel movement, may have had a bowel obstruction and can't take food in, because if you take food in, you got to get food out. So if you've had an obstruction, sometimes these individuals can't go on food. And so we feed them intravenously, not just with IV fluid, not with normal saline lactated ringers, but a very highly concentrated fluid that has high concentrations of glucose, high concentrations of nutrients that are required to sustain the body. But what would be missing? The one substance that we have to get into the diet, linoleic and linolenic acid. And so in hospitalized patients that receive intravenous solutions, total parental nutrition, they typically will become deficient of these essential amino acids. And you can see manifestations of this in the skin. I won't go into the pathology of it as well. Fatty acids are needed to synthesize prostaglandins and phospholipids, which are incorporated. If you remember when we talked about the cell membrane, we talked about phospholipids that are incorporated in the cell membrane throughout the body. And then finally in metabolism, protein metabolism. Body can synthesize about 100,000 to 140,000 different proteins in various forms and functions inside the body. Each protein contains some combination of about 20 amino acids. Protein, most abundant organic substance available in the system. Protein metabolism under normal conditions, cellular proteins are continually recycled. The breakdown of amino acids basically in other energy sources are inadequate. The mitochondria can break down amino acids in the TCA cycle, but in the pecking order, remember, carbohydrates first, lipids second, proteins last resort. Not all amino acids enter into the cycle at the same point. However, ATP benefits vary. Average ATP yield per gram is comparable to that of carbohydrate catabolism. First step in amino acid catabolism is the removal of the amino group. This process requires coenzyme derivative peroxidine. The amino group has to be removed in a process referred to as transamination or deamination, the removal of the amino group. Transamination attaches the amino group to an amino acid to a keto acid. And again, this is the illustration that you see recurrently. We see triglycerides broken down. We just talked about, previously we talked about glycogen being broken down, glucose, small carbon chains enter the TCA cycle. Now we see proteins broken into amino acids, which then, again, smaller carbon chains will then enter the TCA cycle. Now, have to get rid of that ammonia group. The amino group has to be taken away. That process is referred to as transamination, the removal of the amino group. Transamination, an enzyme basically removes the amino group from one molecule and attaches it to keto acid. Now, in the body, ammonia is toxic. So we can't tolerate a significant amount of ammonia. I don't think I go into detail about it. I'm just going to mention it briefly here. It just, the ammonia goes through a process, a series of steps inside the liver called the urea cycle, where the ammonia it's broken down even further, and it's basically rendered harmless and excreted out of the kidneys after this process of the urea cycle. So even though we remove the amino group, it's not used in the system at all. It's readily broken down. It's got to go into the liver and go through this process. That's why liver disease is so tough on the body, because ammonia will quickly build up. Proteins are broken down in our body all the time because cells have to recycle, but it's important that they are deaminated and this amino group is broken down and removed throughout the liver. So just a little aside. But anyway, to utilize amino acids, we have to get rid of that amino group. Deamination, enzyme strips off the amino group and a hydrogen ion from the amino group and produces keto acid and an ammonium ion. Oh, I did mention a urea cycle is that process I just talked about that gets rid of that substance. And again, ammonia is very highly toxic inside the body. The urea cycle is a cycle that basically involves the production of urea. Urea is harmless in the body and it's excreted outside the kidneys. Okay.